It's 7:05. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see we have a very large audience here tonight for Aina's talk, seeing the wood for the trees. And it's the second of Aina's broadcast this week. We have a series ongoing. You've probably seen that from our website. My name is Brendan Fitzsimons, by the way, from the Tree Council of Ireland, and Aina is the current president of the Tree Council. So I think I'll hand over to you, Aina, to kick it off. We'll take questions as we go along. We can record them here on the Q&A, and we will answer them as best we can, either typing the answer if I happen to know it, or saving it for Aina if it's very likely I don't know it. So Aina, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Brendan, for that fine introduction. And as you say, this is the second of the week's entertainment, if you like, on the Tree Council of Ireland website. We have webinars on different topics and at different times of the day and night. So this one is being recorded, so if you're not able to stay for it all, or someone else wants to see it, you can get it afterwards, either on our website or apparently on YouTube as well. So without any further ado, what I'm going to do is try and share my screen with you, and we'll take it from there. Now let us see if I can get this up. There we go. Oh, that looks good. Now that's fine. And if I get rid of all these gallery view people who are looking at me over here, I don't want to, I'll probably get rid of the whole thing if I try that, so I better stop. All right. Now, okay, so seeing the wood for the trees is what I've called this, because what we're talking about, or at least what I'm talking about here, is the whole impact of trees, not individually and by themselves, but as a habitat, as an ecosystem, as a place where other creatures live, as a home for people, as a home for creatures in the woodlands. So you're looking there at a beech woodland in autumn time, because it's not springtime now, in the sense that yesterday my talk was trees in springtime, but now I can talk about trees at any time at all. So seeing the wood for the trees, we're looking here at beech trees, but if you were walking through that woods, you wouldn't just be aware of the trees, you would be aware that there were other things happening there as well. So if we look at other woodlands that we might be walking through, here you are again, a little path going off into the woods. These are hazel trees on both sides, birch there in the front. You might smell things, you might hear things, you might see other things besides the trees. So depending on the kind of woodland you're looking at, there will be different things happening. Now, this one here is a woodland of evergreen trees. And as we know, evergreen trees have their leaves all the year round, which means that there's no periods when the light comes through with no leaves to impede it. And this has a different impact on what can live there. Because really, woodlands are an ecosystem the same as anything else. And all ecosystems work with the same rules of ecology. And the rules of ecology are that the plants make the food and the animals eat it. So whether you're looking at an ecosystem where the plants in the main are the trees, which you get in a woodland, or perhaps you're maybe at a lake and the plants are the tiny little algae that are in the water, or you might be perhaps on a bog and the plants there are going to be the mosses. But something has to make the food, and it's the primary producers that make the food, and then the food is eaten by the animals, who can't obviously fix food, so they eat the food. They're consumers. So our trees make the food. What they do, in fact, is they break up the carbon dioxide molecules by photosynthesis, and the carbon part, we say, they store in their bodies as timber. But of course, timber is the end product of that, because originally, when they take the carbon out of the atmosphere, they're actually, in the presence of water, turning it from CO2 to C6H12O6, adding the hydrogen in there. And C6H12O6 is, of course, a simple sugar molecule. And then the sugar molecules that are like that are processed in the processes of the plant, and in the case of a tree, they're processed all the way down to timber, which had the formula for the wood is obviously a more complicated formula than that for the sugars, but the leaves will have the sugars in them, and there'll be different ways of processing these carbons into other complicated things, like say nuts, for example, will have a more complicated carbon structure, which will be food as well. So all of this food and the different guises of it, all the way from simple sugars right down to lignin in the wood itself, are all food for different parts of the animal kingdom that are there. So we have our consumers then, our animals, and the animals will be perhaps things that will eat the plants themselves. We call those herbivores. Or the animals will be animals that eat other animals, and they'll be carnivores. And we can have primary carnivores, secondary carnivores, visiting carnivores. Reminds me of the relations coming in the good old days when we had relations visiting carnivores. Here's a woodland down in Kerry. This is the yew woodland down there. And while yew is an evergreen tree, nonetheless, some light gets through, and you can see the ground is not as absolutely empty of plants as the last slide was. Here's again another picture of that first woodland I showed you, and the leaves are coming on the trees there now. So we have areas where there's light because there's paths, there's areas where there's shade when the canopy closes. There's all these leaves which fell off the trees last year, and they are breaking down, and they're another source of nutrient, if you like. So what's going to break down leaves, what's going to eat the food that's there, and we're looking at the decomposers. So we've had the primary producers who fix it from the air. We've got the consumers in the categories of herbivores and carnivores, and now we have the decomposers, the lads that are breaking down that plant material and releasing the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, and they need oxygen to do this. So it's a carbon cycle, if you like. The carbon goes up into the air from the decomposing leaves, and it comes back down into the plants by photosynthesis. The carbon, if you could put a magic mark on one of the carbon atoms, and you could somehow see it, you'd see it sometimes in the leaf litter, sometimes on a leaf, sometimes in the atmosphere itself, depending on which form it was. It's a carbon cycle. Here's again other woodlands. We're looking over here at the burn. This is Mullock Moor, and the woodlands over here are much more sparse because the ground, the terrain, the kind of soil in which they grow is quite different, and it's here and there. So you have a more dispersed woodland with hazel trees and the like, but still you have the plants making the food, and you have the animals eating it. So let's have a look at just some of the trees. We're seeing the wood for the trees, but let's have a look at the trees. And I'm just looking at a few trees, picking them out so we can have a look at them again because they're lovely. Here's the oak tree. And of course, we have the wonderful shape of the oak tree. And then the other half of the picture shows us the leaves of the oak tree. And they're particularly easy to identify. They're loop leaves, like a sort of a loopy one. Other leaves have sharper edges and points and prickles and things on the points of them, but not the oak. The oak has these lovely loopy leaves, and oak trees are particularly good habitats by themselves as a tree for other creatures. The leaves make the food, obviously, but then you have all kinds of green flies and things on the leaves, things eating the green flies, things eating the acorns, things eating the bark, all of these things. They reckon there's something like 287 different types of invertebrate species alone. That's animals with no backbones, depending on oak trees. So they have a lot of animal life associated with them. There's your acorn there, and you can see they're like eggs in an egg cup. Now we have other trees similarly. We had this one yesterday, those of you who are looking at things in springtime, and we have the catkins on the left, which are the flowers, if you like, the male and female flowers. The leaves on the right. This is a hazel tree, and here are the hazel nuts that we get in the autumn. So these are all obvious food. We can think of the nuts being food, we can think of the pollen and the catkins being food, but the leaves themselves are food as well, and the bark will be food. All of these things will feed the different animals that are in the woodland. We're looking at an ash tree now, and I just picked one by itself, not in a woodland, just to show you what a fine tree the ash can be by itself like that out on the estuary. And of course the leaves of the ash tree then, as you can see, it's a compound leaf. So that's one leaf where it joins the twig, but all of these leaflets then are part of that. So this is a diagnostic feature. We might have something like maybe 7 or 8 pairs of leaves and a terminal one, which is quite different to a similarly designed leaf on an elder tree, or indeed on something like a walnut tree. They'll have the same kind of complicated compound leaves, but different amount of leaflets, different sizes. Here's our hawthorn tree in the autumn time with the lovely red berries on that. And again, the leaves look like some mad baby infant started chopping them all up into bits and pieces. And again, when they come out in springtime like now, when we were little, we were told you could eat these. They were called bread and cheese. They never struck me as being remotely like the Calvita that we ate for cheese. And even now that I eat posher cheese as well as Calvita, I still don't think they taste like bread and cheese. But nonetheless, I wasn't going to be eating them much, but lots of insects really depend on these because, again, hawthorn, one of our native species, supports a whole plethora of creatures depending on the leaves. So even if we look at the trees in the woodland, even the trees by themselves, they're going to be a source of food. Here we're just looking at a rowan tree, a mountain ash, and we have again the berries on it in the autumn time. It's going to be coming into leaf shortly, and we get lovely flowers on that in springtime with pollen, with nectar, the leaves themselves then after that, with plenty of food for things that can eat the leaves, like caterpillars, things that can suck the nutrients out of them, like things with long mouths, aphids of various sorts. All of these things will be able to feed on this one. And here's the elder tree in the autumn. Remember I was saying about the leaves, that they're compound leaves, the same as the leaves on the ash tree, but we don't have as many leaflets, 2, 4, 5 maybe, 1, 2, 3, 4 and a terminal one at the end. But look at all those beautiful berries on them. And these, of course, are food for the various birds that will feed on them. Pigeons in particular are mad about them. And they eat Lichens of them because pigeons, of course, are vegetarian birds. They don't feed on anything else. And it goes in one end and out the other. And as they perch on the phone lines above my car, I have all of this wonderful purple splashes all over the car. So I can easily understand how elder trees are so common, because that's how they get spread. The seeds in those berries are indigestible. They come out through the other end of the bird and they grow. So I shall soon have a forest of elder trees growing on my car if I'm not careful or don't park it somewhere else. Now we'll move on then to the things underneath. I mean, I could talk about trees forever. We've all the different trees with the things on them, but there's no point. I mean, I've told you the actual role, what they do. They're the ones that produce the main amount of food in a woodland because they have the most leaves, the most canopy. But as you know, I was saying the ones in particular that are deciduous don't get their leaves until now, April, whatever, and the light comes down into the woodland. So the woodland flowers get a great chance, and they're early because they need light to carry out the photosynthesis. They need light to grow. So here's one that you'll find at the moment in the woodlands. It's called the arum lily. It's called the cuckoo pint. It's called all kinds of names, lords and ladies. Even in Irish, it's called bud gyre. Now, gyre is the Connemara word for a dog, and you can translate bud yourselves. But anyway, the thing is that this is a member of the lily family, and it has a very interesting way of carrying on, if you like, in the sense that this is the spadix. It's called the spadix, and if you try and scrunch that and smell it, either it'll smell revolting and you'll say, yuck, that's the most horrible thing I've ever smelled, or else you won't smell anything, because humans have a genetic ability to either smell this or not smell it. So you're smelling away and you can't smell anything. And if somebody like me who's been a bit mean says, "I'll go on, sniff a bit harder," and you give it a terrible sniff altogether, you might in fact snuff up your nose a whole collection of flies, because what this plant is doing, the smell, if you can get it, is of rotten meat. And along come flies, think there's some kind of food in here. They fly down through the thing. And of course, here at the neck of it, there's hairs. But the hairs only bend in one direction. So you can get in, but you can't get out. And these flies all come in, bend the things, and down they go. And now they're all caught in here. So if you can't smelling or snuffing like mad, you might actually snuff them up. But what's going on? Why are they down there? They're down there because this is the female part of the flower, and this is where fertilization has to take place. But plants don't fertilize themselves. So obviously you're not going to fertilize yourself with your own pollen. That wouldn't be good for genetic variation. So all this has to carry on until some fly comes along, some idiot of a fly that's already been trapped in a different one of these. And instead of when he came out and go home to his mammy, he goes off again, still looking for food. Down comes the fly covered in pollen from the previous one. And this pollen then will actually pollinate the flower. The female parts will all be pollinated by the pollen from another plant. And then, of course, once this happens fairly immediately, all the hairs in the neck of it collapse. And the second thing that happens is the pollen of this particular one then becomes ripe. And as the lads are all exiting, flying off about their business, they get dusted with the pollen on the way out. And then, of course, they go off and visit other places, and the same thing might happen again. So the thing is that if you see this in the wintertime, all that's left of this carry-on is just the stalk and the fertilized female part, which are red berries now. So you get a stalk in the winter and the autumn time and the red berries. It's the same arum lily. So it has a very interesting life cycle. And this is happening in any woodland. The leaves are big arrow-shaped leaves. These are not the leaves of that particular one, or what they're doing in the picture, but there you go. The leaves are like big arrows, and that's what they're like. Now here's another one that smells. It smells different. This is the three-cornered leek. It looks like a white bluebell, I suppose, but of course it isn't a bluebell at all. It's a member of the garlic family. It's the three-cornered leek, and it smells like garlic. And you can collect these, you can collect the leaves. The swanky chefs are always saying we can eat these things and make pestos out of them, and this does very well. It grows in the woodland. I remember when I was young, me and Finn McCool, our neighbours' cows used to manage to eat these things, and the milk all tasted the garlic. It was absolutely horrible, I thought, from my porridge. And of course your mother would say, eat it up, it's good for you, garlic is good for you. It might be, but not on your porridge. Anyway, these are all around at the moment, and they do very well. And again, as you walk through the woods, you may not necessarily see them, because if they're not in flower, you only see the leaves and you mightn't know what they are. But the smell of the garlic, you could be in the south of France having pisto or bouillabaisse or something. The smell is only gorgeous. Later on then we move on another bit into the summertime, perhaps in June, July, and we get these ones here, which are the foxgloves. Now at this stage in the woodland, of course, you have your leaves canopy closed. So these will grow on the glades and the verges at the paths, at the path edges where you're walking along, where a bit of light gets in essentially. So it looks as if nature is putting on a show just for us as we walk through our woodlands. And these are called foxgloves. Nothing to do with a fox. Apparently the word foxglove comes from folks, as in people, foxgloves. So people, you know, that these were considered to be little thimbles you could wear on your fingers. And you quite often see these with a great big bumblebee inside, and that they're able to climb up into it, and full of pollen, full of nectar. So they're wonderful for the bees later on in the summertime. Digitalis is the Latin name for them, and they contain a terrible drug which does things to your heart and isn't good at all. So don't be eating them by any chance. But the chemists or the pharmacists or the scientists who find out these things have extracted these things, and they're part of heart medicines now. So when they're prescribed and do what they're supposed to do, they work very well, because indeed, as we all know, all our medicines originally came from plants, and this is one that has medicines that are good for our heart. So the foxgloves, they can be this colour, this lovely purpley colour. Sometimes you see different other ones, maybe white or cream coloured, but this is the real McCoy. And again, it's a little later in the summer than just now. And then, of course, the canopy closes altogether, and there's not enough light for plants to flower any longer. The foxgloves are probably nearly the end of it. But the floor of the woodland isn't empty, isn't devoid of things. So things that can put up with less light are going to be there all the time. So we're looking at mosses here, and we're looking at ferns. Now these are actually ferns, and they're called the hart's tongue fern. Hart is an old English word for a deer, and this leaves must have looked like a tongue, although whether harts actually have green tongues or not, I'm not really sure. I don't think they do. Now what we're looking at here, how do I know it's a fern? And I know it's a fern because ferns don't have flowers on them. They're primitive plants. They're much, much older than flowering plants. They're older than trees. They were around the time of the dinosaurs millions of years ago. And they reproduce by spores. And the spores are on the backs of the leaves. And you can see them coming through at the front, just like stripes like that. But if you turned it over at the back, you would see it much, much better than you've seen it there. And what you're looking at, in fact, is the actual leaves of them. When the spores fall on the ground, they grow into a tiny little thing, and the male and female parts swim together on that polypore, and this plant will grow from there. And because they're such primitive plants, they can grow with much less light than higher plants need. So our woodlands will be full of ferns. We get the hartstongue fern, we get the male fern, we get the hard fern. There's loads of different ferns. I see another thing peeping out there from the back, a different species again. So this is why your woodlands are great places for ferns, because the space is there under the trees. There's not enough light for the flowering plants at this time of the year, and the ferns are able to manage really well. Here's another plant that, or whatever you might call it, that you'd find in a woodland. We're looking here at a lichen or lichens, and these are actually a half and half, if you like. They're a combination of an algae and a fungus, a mushroom and a seaweed, if you think about it. But what you have is it sits on things, so it has no roots. It gets all its nutrients from the air, and the algal part of it, it's the cells with the chlorophyll in it, they're able to photosynthesize and fix the carbon. And then the fungal part of it are the hardness. You feel these are hard, so they're the railway system, if you want. And what's happening is that the nutrients that the plant, or the plant part of the algal part, can fix from the air are distributed then by the fungal part. Now, as I said, they've no roots. They get all their nutrients from the air, and if the air is clean, bingo, you get Lichens of this. And if the air is not, if the air is polluted, you don't. So to see lots and lots of these in a woodland, they're a biological indicator of air quality. So they're telling us that the air quality here is really good, and this is great if you see them like this. They don't do any harm to the tree. They don't do it in any way. I mean, they just grow on it. You often see them growing on gravestones. You see them growing on gates. You see them growing on electric poles. If you stood there long enough yourself, you'd probably grow one of these on yourself, a lichen. So then you get different colours of them, and the longer they are and the hairier they are, the better the air quality. So the air quality where I took this picture is really good, because they're like green steel wool, grey steel wool sticking out. Some of these are like scabby things. Other places they're just like marks of paint. But if the air quality is very bad, because there's too much sulfur dioxide and things in it, you won't get these there at all. So then of course these then are food for other things that will feed on the lichens too. So to see a tree with lichens on it, they can be on a live tree, they can be on a dead tree. It's an indication of excellent air quality in the woodland, as you would expect. Now, other things that grow, these are the fungi by themselves without any help from algae. So these are fungi. Now, fungi are mad jokes. They're not plants in the way everything else I've been speaking about is a plant that contains chlorophyll, that can take nutrients from the air, that can break up the carbon dioxide molecules and save up all the carbon. These are the last group I was telling you about when I started. These are the decomposers. These are the lads who break down things that have died, because if we had no decomposers, you'd be up to your oxters and dead trees and dead leaves and everything else. So these will live on the dead plants. They will break down the material in the cells, and these are the fruiting bodies. Now, the fruiting bodies are just appearing at a certain time of the year, mainly in autumn, although there are some fruiting bodies and some fungi in this time of the year as well. But the rest of the time, the fungal strands go through whatever it is that they're breaking down, like spiders' webs for all the world. Now, they're mainly things that will feed on dead plants, but some of them, I'm fear, will feed on living things. Something like the honey fungus, for example, will actually live on a live thing and kill the tree, because they take the nourishment out of the tree as it's growing. But in the main, the mushrooms or the fungi we find in the woodlands are on things that are already dead. Now, some of them are beautiful and taste gorgeous and you can eat them. Others will give you liver failure when they'll drop dead and you have to leave one on the mantelpiece for harvesting, so he doesn't have to cut you open, or whoever's the state pathologist at the moment. So I have no expert in, and I certainly wouldn't tell anyone to eat any class of a mushroom unless they have prior knowledge from somebody else as to whether it's fit to be eaten or not. But you know, some of them do have wonderful tastes and some of them, as I said, contain terrible poisons. But the trees don't care about that. What's happening here is that this thing is getting its nourishment from the dead plant upon which it is growing. Here's a dead tree lying on the ground and this bracket fungus is growing on that. There's lots and lots of different fungi, and because they're not hidebound to having green molecules in them like plants have to have, you get them in different colors. You get them in reds, you get them in purples, you get them in different colors like these lovely golden ochres. So they're doing a job in the woodland. If we didn't have these, if we didn't have them breaking down the leaves, or we didn't have them breaking down the trees, nothing would break down, and eventually all the nutrients would be locked up in the trees, in the plants, and would go no further. That's what you get on a bog, actually, because we don't have anything like the decomposers on a bog. It's too acidic, it's too wet, and the plants don't break down. So you end up with all the plants on top of each other for thousands of years, compressed, and we call it turf, which is what it is. But it's the plants that didn't break down, and indeed, if they're there long enough, we have coal and we have oil and we have gas. But these are all plants that didn't break down, and the carbon that they took out when they grew is still in them. But in places like a woodland, these fungi and indeed bacteria that we don't see are able to do the unlocking for us and keep the carbon cycle going around. So anyway, these are all easy to see. These are all things that if they're there at all, you'll see, because while they might be decomposers or while they might be carbon fixers, they can't move. That's the difference between them and the next group, which are mammals. So we've lots of animals that live in the woods, and our animals, of course, the world's animals are divided into ones with backbones, vertebrates, and ones without backbones, invertebrates. So mammals are animals, birds are animals, frogs are animals, butterflies are animals. An animal is a non-plant. And the animals then are dependent on the primary producers for their food. Some of them will eat the plants, they're called herbivores. Some of them will eat other animals, they're called carnivores. And some of them are, they don't mind, they'll eat plants or animals, they're omnivores. And we're looking at an omnivore here, which of course is our badger on Brock, one of our native species. Now, badgers have wonderful senses of smell. So if you see a badger, you're doing very well. You've been staking it out for days. You're upwind of it. You've come at the right time, because generally badgers have more sense than to appear when people are around, and they can smell them there, so that you're not likely to see them unless you're really organized. But what you might see is a badger set. And here's a badger set here. Here's a hole in a bank. And the badger set is in here, and the badger then will have been living perhaps in a bank in a woodland for 3, 4, 5, 6 generations. I mean, there are place names in Ireland called after the badger, Brock, Pulbrock, Clonbrock, indicating that there's been the badger set in that area for ages, because it's a matriarchy. Mammy lives in the badger set, has her babbies, and then when they get big enough, she boots them out, tells them to get a haircut and get a job, and she retains it. And eventually one of her daughters inherits the set and keeps it going. And the males are booted out, and they have to go and move from territory to territory and find mates for themselves, and they don't last. I mean, it's not a permanent set of Mammy and Daddy Badger. It's each year they come along and they start up again. So the badger, Mrs. Badger, this is her place, and she keeps it very well. So in springtime, before she's going to give birth, having had visited by some wandering Lothario, she will perhaps pull out all the bedding, air it, and then bring it all back in again, so it's all nice and fresh when she gives birth in the end of April. So how would you know it was a badger set and it didn't belong to a rainyard, it didn't belong to a fox? Because foxes live in dens as well, and foxes can live in woodlands. Well, I have to tell you that foxes are terrible, dirty, smelly creatures altogether. They have no manners at all. They leave all kinds of bones and things outside. The smell of them as they spray, they have a special scent gland that they spray around their territory, the badger, of course, as I was saying, is a very clean creature, and they have latrines. They have actually a special place that they go to do their business, so they don't spread it all around and have smells and things like that. So if you come across a hole in a wood that's fairly big, look and see, can you smell anything, can you see anything, and you'll be able to detect whether or not it belongs to a badger or whether it belongs to a fox. Sometimes the foxes take over the badgers, and the badgers get mad, and because the badger sets have different tunnels, so they might just cut off a bit of it and leave the territory to the fox. But the fox is an untidy tenant, so you'd know whether it was a fox or not. You might find hedgehogs in the woodland because, again, hedgehogs are creatures that live in places where there are trees and where there are things to eat, because they're carnivores, pure and simple. The fox and the badger will eat plants and will eat animals. Now, it's not a matter, I mean, what about you or me? If I give up eating meat, am I now a herbivore? I'm not. Humans are omnivores because we have the digestive ability to digest meat and to digest plant material. We may choose not to eat any meat. We may choose, if you were an Inuit or people in those areas, not to eat any plant material because it doesn't grow there. But that doesn't make you become a carnivore or a herbivore. So if you don't have the ability to digest it, then that's it. So here's your hedgehog. Hedgehogs can only digest meat. So Mrs. Tiggy Winkle and Enid Blyton and feeding them with bread and milk and apples, that's me eye, because the poor hedgehog cannot digest any of those things because it is not actually a herbivore or an omnivore. It doesn't have the wherewithal to digest those things. So don't be, if you do have a hedgehog in your garden, don't be putting out bread and milk for it. And the tin of the dog food, if you want to feed it, or meat is what you give them. So in the woodland, you could get a hedgehog as well. Now, hedgehog on Gráinneog, the ugly one, called so because introduced to Ireland, if you could believe this, by the Danes. The Vikings brought these to Ireland. I remember asking kids once, why did they bring these here? And the kids said, oh, they brought them as weapons to throw at each other. Have a hedgehog. But of course, they didn't bring them as weapons. They apparently are a form of food. Hog, clue is in the name. They're supposed to taste like pork. You cover them in clay and you bake them in the embers of the fire and strip it off, and the skin, spines and everything come off, and the flesh is tasting of, reminiscent of pork. But of course, we can't do that, of course, because they're protected by law nowadays, and you wouldn't want to be eating hedgehogs anyway. But that's where they came from. Now, squirrels then, of course, we might be very lucky and we'd see squirrels in the woodland. Now, we have the red squirrel, which is our native squirrel. We might see the grey squirrel, which is not our native one. So we have two different ones. The American one is the grey squirrel, which is much bigger than the red squirrel, which is much smaller. And they are both herbivores. So they feed, as we all know, they feed on nuts, and they don't hibernate for the winter time, because why in the name of goodness would you be running around in September gathering up lashings of nuts if you were going to go asleep and not waking up again until March or April, which is when creatures like hedgehogs come out of hibernation because there's no food for them in the winter time, because there's no snails and slugs to be eating, so there's nothing for them to eat, and they hibernate. But squirrels don't hibernate because they've collected the food, like as if you went shopping, filled up your trolley with stuff, brought it home, put it in the cupboard, and then departed out of the house for 6 months. People would think you were crackers. What are you buying all the food for? So squirrels don't hibernate, and in fact the easiest time to see squirrels is when there's no leaves on the trees. They have a dray, they spend night, they come out during the day, they're daytime feeders, and if you're out early in the morning when it's bright before there's too much disturbance, you could very well see squirrels. Now in the Dublin area we don't have any red squirrels because the nasty grey, sorry I'm going the wrong way now, the nasty greys were introduced into Ireland in 1911 as a wedding present for a couple up in County Longford in Newcastle Forbes who were getting married. And as you do, they had a swanky wedding. Obviously there was more than 25 at it, and they had a marquee or whatever they had, and they invited the Duke of Buckingham, who came over from England. And what would you bring if you were coming to a couple who has everything? He brought them a lovely picnic basket. So they were taking photographs apparently of their gifts, and when the Duke of Buckingham produced this and they opened the lid, they took the picture, and out jumped 6 pairs of grey squirrels and scattered off into the woods. I mean, I know I'd be raging if I was expecting a picnic hamper and I got 6 grey squirrels, but that's what they got. And from those in Longford, those squirrels, they reproduced and multiplied. Because they're an American species, they're bigger, they're a different species, they don't interbreed, but they're able to digest things like acorns before they're ripe, which means that by the time the poor red squirrel goes looking for them, there's nothing for them to eat. These fellows as well have diseases to which they themselves are immune, different squirrel poxes, but in the proximity of the reds, they actually pass it on. So as a consequence, if you looked at the map of Ireland now, 100 years later, there are very, very few red squirrels on the eastern half. Now, the Shannon was a great barrier to this. So the squirrels on the western half of Ireland and in the southern part of Ireland are still the reds, but the greys are down all along the eastern side. And I was saying that these are all herbivores, so they'll eat the nuts when they have them. But what do they eat the rest of the time? Did you ever think? What do they eat in April and May and June and July when there's no nuts? And what they eat are the trees. They actually eat the bark of the trees, the twigs of the trees, and they have the Phoenix Park destroyed because the trees up there, the ones that grow to about 15 years of age, the squirrels, the grey squirrels up there are eating the bark off them. And as you know, if you eat the bark off a tree, there's nothing for the nutrients. That's where the food travels from the leaves down into the roots. And if you remove a circle completely around that, that's the end of it. So the squirrels can cause a great deal of damage to trees because of their herbivorous tendencies. So have they no enemies? Well, they do. This is the enemy of the squirrel. This is a thing called the pine marten on Crathcron. The pine marten, again, is a native species, a bit bigger, and they can climb up the trees after them. Now, it is the enemy of the red squirrel, but it's much bigger than the red squirrel. The red squirrel is quite a small little squirrel. He can go right out to the edge of the branches. But the other yoke, the American squirrel, the grey squirrel, is a much heavier creature. And he came from America, of course. He came as a present. He didn't come with wolverines and polecats and all the things that were his enemies in America. So the grey squirrel has no notion that the pine marten is actually an enemy. So pine martens are on the increase in Ireland we've more woodland now, and as a consequence they're nabbing the grey squirrels. So there's been research done over in Sligo and collecting droppings of pine martens and looking in woodlands, and they have discovered that in places where there's plenty of pine martens, the grey squirrels have been wiped out. They don't have a notion that they're there, whereas there's a tribal memory or a folk memory in the red squirrels, and if they smell that there's pine martens in the area, they keep well out of their way, whereas the other poor American dopes don't recognise that this is the enemy, and they're getting caught by this. Now, there are no pine martens in the Phoenix Park at the moment. I don't think they've been able to cross the M50. I wouldn't crossing the M50 myself, so I don't know as a natural predator how it would work, but certainly they're spreading around other parts of the country. And I actually saw one in a woodland myself there in Wicklow not so long ago, whenever I was out in Wicklow, whenever we were able to be going places, and it was in the daytime, and it had its own nest away up in the tree, and it scooted up the tree, could climb up the tree, no bother at all, and it was great to see it. So you might, if you're not in Dublin woodland, you might be able to see pine martens if you're lucky. They're very fond of cherries, so I mean they're all these successful things are carnivores and herbivores, so they're actually omnivores. So if there's a wild cherry tree in your woodland, keep an eye, because you sometimes see the droppings of the pine martens and they're full of cherry stones, because obviously they can't digest those. So if you have a wild cherry tree anywhere, not those old Japanese things there, but a proper wild cherry in the woodland, you might be able to keep an eye and see is there any pine marten nabbing the berries. Our smallest mammal is this one here. It's the Pygmy Shrew, and the Pygmy Shrew, of course, is, again, it's a carnivore, and it has to eat its own weight in food every half hour or it'll die of starvation. It's half the size of a mouse, the creature, and it can't sleep all night like we can, because it would wake up dead, because it would have died of hunger. So it eats things like earwigs, it eats things like black clocks, earwigs, anything you can find on the woodland floor. So a very common creature, but rarely seen because it's so small and so tiny. Woodlands are great places for bats, and bats, like the hedgehogs, are carnivores, and these ones feed on things that fly around in the air at night, beginning with the letter M. So they feed on moths and midges, mosquitoes. In fact, a little bat like this can actually eat 3,000 midges in a night. So bats are our friends, and woodlands are great places for them. We've 10 different species of breeding bat in Ireland. We have small little ones like the pipistrelle. We see them flying around like this through the woods, and they come out at night to hunt. And there's all sorts of lies about the bats, that they're blind, they're not blind. How, if they were blind, why aren't they crashing into things? I mean, if you were out in the woodlands at night, you'd be crashing into things if you're not blind. So not only are they not blind, but they actually have extra sensory, they have they make sounds, they emit sounds in order to be able to know where they're going. And woodlands are great places for the bats. They're able to go in and out among the trees. In fact, apart from the lesser horseshoe bat, which lives in caves, I think all the rest of our bats are very happy to live in wooded areas and to have their breeding roosts in hollow trees. You get breeding roosts for bats in the summertime, and then they hibernate away underground in places where the temperature doesn't drop below 10 degrees because they don't want to freeze while they're asleep. And they can also hibernate in hollow trees if the tree is big enough and thick enough. But they mostly have their summer roosts, their maternity quarters in the woodlands. So it's a bit early yet for them to come out. There's no point in waking up if your grub isn't ready. So the place is not full of midges and moths and mosquitoes yet, but it will be. Come April, they'll be coming out, and they emit these terribly high-pitched sounds which are echoed as they hit off something, come back at a slower speed, and they're able to detect that there's something in their way or an insect that they're about to catch. So you can buy bat boxes, as they're called. They're actually oscilloscopes. They're some kind of an electrical thing that if you turn the knob to it, it tunes into the sounds of the bats and reduces it down to an audible signal that we can hear with our ears. And it's a great thing to go. I think you can get them online for about €50 if you want to find something to spend your money on. And when the bats come out, then bring it to your woodland that's within your 5k or whatever will be allowed to walk by the end of April, and turn it to the right tune at dawn or at dusk, and you'll be able to know tick, 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 tick. It's a great way of actually getting another dimension out of your woodlands. They won't fly into your hair unless your hair is full of moths and midges and mosquitoes, or unless your head is completely empty and the sound waves go right through. They're more silly old wives' tales. We don't think birds are going to fly into our hair, so why would you think it of bats? Don't get your science off the internet and old wives' stories. They won't fly into your hair, I'm telling you. Woodlands then are places for deer as well, and this is the Sika deer. We have three types of deer in Ireland. We have the red deer, which is our native species. We have the Sika deer, which was brought in by Lord Powerscourt way back in the 1840s. He was gallivanting around the world and thought it was a great idea to bring back stuff. And then we have the fallow deer with the big flat horns. They're in parks. We get them in the Phoenix Park. We get them down in Mallow, places like that. And like the what you call it, the hedgehog that came in with the Danes, the fallow deer came in with the Normans as food and for hunting and what have you. But the ones that Lord Powerscourt brought in, these Sika deer, they managed to cross themselves with the help of Lord Powerscourt with the red deer. So much of our Wicklow deer, for example, are hybrids between red and Sika. The only pure herd of Sika that's left, and indeed the only pure herd of red that's left, are below in Kerry in the mountains around Mangerton and places like that, where the herds are completely separate and they're pure Sika and pure red deer down there. Everywhere else, if you see deer, they're actually hybrids between one and the other. And again, like the squirrels, deer are completely herbivores. They'll eat grass, they'll eat whatever, but they'll also eat trees, and they'll demolish little trees that are growing like this. So if you plant woodland trees and then you come back and there they are gone, it's because of the deer. So it's a really big cost when we're planting native trees to fence it away from these deer. You see sometimes they do plots in woodlands where they put a big 8-foot fence around a square, and they don't put it around another place, and then you go back and you see the ones inside, all their seedlings that have regenerated because they haven't been gobbled up by the deer. So the deer can be a great disadvantage in woodlands because they stop natural regeneration. They stop the coming back of the trees. When the trees are grown big, they can't be eaten by the deer too much, although they do itchy their heads off them, and you see marks on the bark from when they lose their horns every year. But they eat the saplings, they eat the baby trees, and they stop things becoming established, so it can be quite difficult. Now again, we have got rid of their enemies. In a not proper ecosystem, there would be the enemy of the deer, which is the wolf. And the wolves would keep manners on the deer, and they would keep them at a reasonable number. We don't have any wolves in Ireland. Eamon Ryan was talking about bringing them back, but I can't see why if I was a wolf, I'd kill myself running after a deer if there was a nice fat sheep in the field next door. So there's a problem because we have so much land now under farming. You can't bring back something like a wolf unless you have a forestry area the size of, I don't know, County Louth or something, where there isn't anything else, only deer and wild things to be eaten. So it's difficult. It's easy to make things extinct. It's easy to change the ecosystem to a worse situation. It's more difficult to get it back. But we have the deer, plenty of deer. People like to see deer in woodland. In fact, that's unless you're the owner of the woodland. Now I move on to other creatures that are in the wood as well. So we have lots of birds, and you know, seeing the wood for the trees, it's full of trees, so how do you communicate? And of course, the woodland birds all communicate by song. This is what the dawn chorus is all about. And of course, the only birds that sing are the male birds. The women never open their mouths. Imagine living in a world where women never spoke. But this is the case of the birds. So here's a male robin, and he's up early before the sun rises too much, and he's busy singing, I live here, and I'll bloody well burst any other robin that comes near me. And he's holding territory. And then, of course, after another while, I have lived in this wonderful place, and I'm looking for a girlfriend, and I am the best thing ever, and I can sing much louder than the fellow over there. So the song is for two things. The song is to hold territory, and the song is to attract a mate. Some birds hold territory the whole time and they sing all summer. Other fellas, wants to get the wife, never sing again, you know yourself. Anyway, there's your robin. This one is the great tit, and we hear them at the moment. They're setting up territory too. Teacher, 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 cheeky, squeaky, squeaky gate kind of a sound. Now, these, of course, a lot of cases our woodlands got reduced very much. So many of the woodland birds became established as garden birds, and we tend to think of them as garden birds, but they truly were woodland birds. And all this early song is in order to actually communicate in a place where you can't see. You don't get the same song, say, with colonies of seabirds, for example. They're nesting all together. They're quite different. They're not getting rid of the neighbor or anything like that. It's a different setup. But in a woodland, they have to communicate by song. Here you have the chaffinch. We know it's a finch because of the thick bill, and these are seed-eating birds in general. But of course, when they're rearing young, they catch insects and feed the young with those because it's much more protein in insects. But when they're adults themselves, they'll feed on seeds, and they'll feed on things like this pine cone that they're sitting perched on there. Here's a jay. A jay is a member of the crow family. It's a woodland bird very much. It never went to slum it in the gardens, and it would remind you of a magpie. I suppose it's smaller than that and has a very distinctive call, has lovely blue feathers on it. And this fellow is one that's very fond of eating acorns, and they too will store them and hide them away in places to have them for the winter time. Blackbirds are, of course, a woodland bird too. He's on the leaf litter poking around because blackbirds feed on the ground. This poor worm, I'd say, is going to be, I'm sure, caught you in a minute. And again, wonderful calls. This blackbirds are really sort of nervous Nellies. They have an alarm call that warns the other birds as well. It doesn't just warn blackbirds. Other things, when they hear the alarm call, the blackbird, other creatures think, oh, something going on here, and they all take to hiding if this is the case. Here's the wood pigeon. We all know him. Coo, 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 coo. And the wood pigeon is probably the only one that's a real out and out herbivore, and it doesn't even feed its young with any kind of creepy crawlies. It produces a kind of a cheesy stuff in its crop and opens its mouth, and the young have to stick their heads into mammy's mouth and drink up whatever's coming up. I'm glad I'm not a pigeon. But again, they feed on plants, they feed on leaves. In the woodlands, the wood pigeon, they'll feed on the cabbages in your garden too if you're not careful. Here's our smallest bird. Here's the Gold Crest, and the Gold Crest is absolutely tiny. And guess why it's called the Gold Crest? Because it has this little thing on top of its head, which if you're above it, you can look down and see it. I don't know how that photograph got taken, because mostly they're way above in the canopy and they have a tsk sound. You wouldn't really distinguish the sound in the same way as you would on other birds. And again, they like to feed on little small seeds and pine cones and things like that. So you get them in woodlands where you have this lot of coniferous trees. Here's a new fellow into our woodlands. This is the woodpecker, this black and white woodpecker, that the greater spotted woodpecker that has come back by itself from Wales. This was a creature that was in our woodlands. It has an Irish name, on Snagmore, so it was part of our fauna long ago. Our woodlands got cut down to 2 or 3% coverage in the country by the beginning of the 1900s. So some of these things became extinct because their habitat was destroyed. There's a huge amount of them in Wales, and some of them have come back from there. They weren't introduced, they came of their own bat. Now, they don't communicate by song, they communicate by beating the tree. So you get a hollow tree, the thing whacks its beak off that, and it's a drumming sound, and the male does it. And if you're in the woodlands early and it's quiet and you hear this drumming sound, it used to be just Wicklow, but now you hear them in Kilkenny, you hear them in Wexford, you hear them in Meath. So keep an eye out for this drumming sound. You can't mistake it once you hear it. You may never see the woodpecker, but you'll hear it at this time of the year if you keep your ears open. And of course, here's the cock cron, here's the cown crich. It's the long-eared owl. We have 2 owls in Ireland. We have the barn owl, which is a farmyard fellow, and then we have the long-eared owl, this one here, who's a creature of woodlands. And again, is a nighttime thing, and he'll just sit on the branches during the day. Look how cryptic the colours are, and you could be sitting on a branch beside the trunk of a tree in plain daylight and you wouldn't see it. And these, of course, are carnivores, and they hunt at night on the smaller mammals, on the little shrews and on the mice and on the rats and things that are on the forest floor. So they're part of it as well. And then finally, because I'm running out of time, we have the animals with no backbones, the invertebrates. So we have the green ones that feed on the leaves, like things like green flies and caterpillars, and this one, which is a shield bug. And this particular shield reminded people of the Roman shields like you see in Gladiator and things like this. And this fellow will walk on leaves, suck the sap out of it, and it'll be part of the crowd that feed on leaves. And then if you brought something like an umbrella into your wood, turned it upside down, shook the leaves when they were there, things like this might fall into your umbrella. And if they're green and they don't move, or they don't move much, they're the herbivores. But if things fall into your umbrella, like say ladybirds, which are bright red, or spiders that are running around the place, you know that they're carnivores because they hunt for their prey, and they'll be up on the leaves as well because they eat the herbivores. There's food chains everywhere. Food chains on the forest floor. Here's the centipede, and the centipede is running around through the leaf litter, feeding on the things that are decomposing or eating the dead leaves. Here's another one. This fellow here is your black beetle, the clocks, and it's again a carnivore that'll be running around the woodland at night. And what are they eating? They're eating things like this poor old dustbin man. Here's your woodlouse, and the woodlouse is actually feeding on the dead leaf itself as a source of food. You get them in your gardens under your flower pots, but they're originally woodland creatures. So it would be terrible if we lost our woodlands. And we're cutting them down because obviously as the population increases and we need more space to grow food, deforestation is happening. 13 million hectares annually are being destroyed, and virgin forests are being destroyed or converted. You know, if the virgin forest is there, it's always been forest, nothing else is happening, then you have all the attending biodiversity I've been speaking about. If you go out to a field and decide to plant 100 trees in the field, it's a field with 100 trees in it. It isn't a woodland. Now, over the years, as the trees grow, creatures that like to live in woodlands will come and take up residence there. But a virgin woodland is going to have all of these things there for a very long time. So much better for biodiversity. So it's important to keep the woodlands that we have and to value them. This is obviously they like their wood so much here in this part of Ireland that they put up the sign. This is Tipperary. They put up a sign to say a merry wood, a bird sanctuary. So that's the end of my story. But if you want to hear more from me, you can go out and buy my book, which is now being published by O'Brien Press next week. And it tells us all about how our wild world works, from the birds and the bees to the boglands and the ice caps. And of course, what we're doing to it by changing it and the things that we're doing. So if we appreciate how the world works, then we have more time for these measures that have been brought in to stop climate change happening. So Brendan Nessie has appeared, so obviously I'm talking too long. So my time is up. So thank you all very much indeed. So I shall stop sharing the screen now and we go back to whatever we go back to. Am I gone?
Yeah, well, Aina, I think that was tremendously interesting. The fact that virtually the entire audience stayed with you for the entire time, I think, was a credit to your storytelling. Most of the questions we got, some were answered by other participants and some I was able to answer, but there are a few that stick in mind. Hold on a second now while I adjust my glasses. Orla wants to know what your favorite bird is. Now, we asked you your favorite tree last night and you weren't very...
No. I don't have a favourite anything because I love this and then I hate everything else. They're all my favourite. I mean, they're all part of it.
It's the same answer. Essentially, whatever she's looking at the moment is her favourite.
Okay. I like spiders because they're cannibals. They eat each other. I see a question here. It says, are lords and ladies carnivorous? Do they eat the flies? And yes. No, they don't eat the flies any more than flowers eat bees. The flies are the agents of pollination for them. They come in and they trap them and they keep them there till the one that comes and pollinates, and then the hairs collapse and they all escape. There are some carnivorous plants. There are things like you get on the bogs, the sundews, and that they do eat the insects. But the woodlands are grand. The lords and ladies don't eat them. They're only using them as a means to an end.
Okay, Francis Conley asked, do all birds, you know, when we put stuff out into our back gardens to feed various birds and all, do all birds eat garden food or food we put out in the back garden?
No, they don't. Of course they don't. I mean, you know, birds only come to our bird tables when they're stuck. They prefer their stuff that they can have themselves for a start. So you put up your bird tables, and the birds that can actually relate to that. I mean, the most common bird in Ireland is the wren. We have more than 6 million wrens. You have wrens. I see wrens in my garden sometimes, indeed in Dublin, but they never come to the bird table. They're running around on the ground, although they can fly, and they're feeding on things in the flower pots. They're feeding on invertebrates. Things like blackbirds, they won't go onto a bird table. They feed on the ground. If you want to feed the blackbirds, you might put out apples cut in half and stuff on the ground. But lots of things aren't going to come to your bird table because they're not interested in the food that you put out for them. It's the songbirds, so finches and the tits and the robins and the thrushes. They're the ones that will come to your bird table. But there are lots of things that don't. I mean, you wouldn't see a snipe on the bird table. You wouldn't see a curlew. You wouldn't see anything like that. It's not their thing. It's just the ones that we get. But Birdwatch Ireland were doing a garden bird survey, and they've had up to 60 species found in birds in people's gardens. So there's plenty to keep you going with the
Okay, you're doing a tremendous lot for the tree counts at the moment, but I have a question here from Sinead Cunan. Do you still do your classroom visits and so forth?
Well, there's nobody visiting schools for the last year.
I know, but I mean,
in these times, yes, I'm a heritage and schools expert. God help us. And in fact, since this COVID started, I do these kind of Zoom things. I can Zoom into your classroom and talk to your kids by arrangement if we want to do that. And I have been doing visits, but not since this time last
COVID.
Oh, okay. You know, but I love that. I like visiting schools. I take the kids out and we go around the schoolyard, and it's always a great buzz when a kid says, I never knew that. It's an even better buzz when the teacher says, I never knew that. It's great. It's a great thing to do. But yeah, no, not at the moment on account of COVID, no.
Okay, Richard Daly, what is the oldest tree in Ireland? I have to confess, I don't know that. Maybe you do.
Well, didn't we do all this thing for our heritage? In fact, if you want to know the real answer, tune in tomorrow to Cormac. He's giving a whole talk on veteran trees, and veteran means very old. Yew trees live a long time, and there's one below in Killarney, the Muckross yew, which they reckon they brought in from Inishfallen Monastery in 11 something or another.
So Richard, the answer there would be tune in tomorrow to Cormac Downey's talk, where he's going to discuss veteran trees, and he almost certainly knows the answer.
You know the answer to that, or we'll have an opinion. And he's starting at 11:30 in the morning. And again, we'll record it. It'll go up. Siobhan will put it up eventually on YouTube and on our website if you're actually tied up at that time. But I'd say it's a yew. Probably, maybe it's the Silken Thomas yew in what you call it down in Maynooth. There's them down in Clare who swear by the Brian Boru oak. So, you know, it depends. It pays your money and it takes your choice. Anyway, Cormac will reveal all.
Yeah. There was another question there from Sinead Gary. Any advice for encouraging woodlands in urban areas? I suppose you could contact Orla Farrell of Easy Treesy, look them up on the website. They certainly are highly involved in that and are partnered with the Tree Council in trying to plant 1 million trees.
And Orla is giving a talk on Friday at 2 o'clock.
And she's giving a talk on Friday.
And again, like me, she'll be answering questions afterwards. And I mean, it's very hard to get hold of Orla. I was trying to ring her up today, and she was out planting trees. She wasn't at home. She came back and rang me up afterwards. But, you know, she's the one that does it. You encourage the county council. You tell them to stop mowing the bloody fields and lawns and things and plant a few trees instead. And you don't break the heads off them and knock them down with footballs when you have them in your park.
Okay, just another one. We had this yesterday, I think, as well. Will the recording be available? Yes, the recording of this will be available on our new YouTube channel, which the Tree Council now has. And the first blockbuster we've put on it was Aina's talk yesterday. So this will go on to it as well. The next one is Joe Walsh asked about the trees with the microscopic root system where they pass nutrients to one another. We had a question asking yesterday how do trees talk to one another, but this is in the same. There's a lot of it. I suppose best thing to say
all the questions. The next person that answered that fellow called Mark Reed has given a website for that. So I think again we're going to be putting this up on our website.
Yeah, there's a lot of.
Someone wants to know how long will it be? I think we're going to leave these recordings up. It's not like the RTE player that have gone away in a fortnight. They're going to be available for much longer than that.
Joe, I'd say the question there, the answer there really is there's a lot of research going on at the moment in terms of the interaction between tree roots and the various mycorrhizal fungi associate them and all the rest of it. We couldn't possibly answer it here, but it's an area of a lot of study at the present moment.
Somebody wants to know, why does ivy grow on trees?
Actually, Mark Reed said monumental trees. I presume that's in relation to the oldest tree in Ireland. Okay.
Why does ivy grow on trees, Brendan?
Why does ivy grow on trees? Because ivy will grow on a wall, or it will grow on a telegraph pole. Famously, it'll grow on anything. What it does,
it'll grow on you if you stood there long enough.
It would, yeah.
Because ivy is a plant that hasn't got any support, so it grows towards the light, and the tree supports it. So the tree is just something that it doesn't suck nutrient out of the tree. It's literally only a crutch for it.
Yeah. What can we do to protect our woodlands from development? Well, that's a very complicated question, I suppose.
What kind of development? They're not building houses in woodlands, are they?
Again, it's a very broad question. It's very difficult to answer that question. There is a licensing system whereby once a woodland is established, you need a felling license to get rid of it or to remove it. And part of the equation in terms of getting such a license is that you have to plant an equivalent area of woodland somewhere else. So that's probably the best top of the head answer I can give you. What's your favorite tree book, Aina?
Well,
book about trees.
Well, I have lots of books about trees. Depends on what I want to find out at the time. I have a couple of tree books that are tree identification books, and I wouldn't be without those. Mitchell's one is very good. And then you have books about trees that are full of interesting facts. Like I was saying, the one that our Tree Council book called Heritage Trees. That's a great read, and beautiful pictures of trees in Ireland that are really, really good. So that's one by Aubrey anyway, he's done it, and you can available from the Tree Council. And there's lots of books on trees, and you know, like everything else, I must have 10 books on trees. So you know, my favorite book, you know, ones that talk about trees and tell you something. Around the World in 80 Trees, that was a great one. I was reading that there recently. So you know, there's some books that are standard books that you would have to have.
Okay, I suppose we better wind up shortly. Is it possible to see any of the talks from earlier in the week? Yes, they'll all be on the Tree Council YouTube channel. And there was a question which popped up a couple of times and disappeared. What is the Tree Council's attitude to Sitka spruce plantations? Sitka spruce plantations, like all other trees, have a part to play in the reforestation of Ireland. We have 11% tree cover. The average European is about 35%. And we need to plant more trees of all types. I suppose that's probably the Tree Council's attitude.
Yeah, but the Sitka spruce is actually a crop. It's a crop, it's a job, it's timber for housing. The same way as a field of barley or a field of potatoes are a crop for food, the trees are a crop for industry and for housing, and we need them. And the right tree in the right place. There's no planting of trees on blanket bogs or any of that. It hasn't happened in 40 years. It did happen in less enlightened times, and sometimes people think it still happens. It doesn't still happen any longer. And there's really tight, as Brendan said, there's really tight legislation. You have to get permission, you have to have a license, there has to be a certain density, you have to have other trees around it. They can't, like deciduous trees, to make it look better. You can't have it near waterways. There's quite a lot of legislation covering the planting of Sitka spruce, and they are a crop, and they give 12,000 people in rural areas employment. But you don't want the whole country covered in Sitka spruce any more than anything else. Our amenity woodlands are great, oak and ash, but they grow half as slowly as the Sitka spruce. Sitka spruce take carbon out of the atmosphere all of the time because they grow winter and summer, or oak and or ash, because they only have leaves for half the year, only do it for half the year. So a 40-year-old oak and a 40-year-old Sitka spruce, the Sitka spruce will have taken twice as much carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So there's horses for courses. I'd hate the country to be entirely covered in Sitka spruce, because the biodiversity of that will be very little, because they come from British Columbia. And again, as I said, they brought the seeds, they didn't bring all the paraphernalia with them. Sitka spruce forests in British Columbia are quite different affairs, because the trees will have different ages. There'll be other species present and all of that. So, you know, that's the story. I mean, again, you could give a whole talk about this. I bet
you could. I think one of the key problems there is we have so little forest, 11%. Most of our land is either peat or it's in agriculture, and Sitka spruce plantations, while having nowhere near the biodiversity of native woodlands, have considerably more biodiversity than many of our agricultural systems. So it's all a question of balance and, you know, rationality.
Yeah, right. I think that might be the most of it, Brendan. Now, what do you think?
Yeah, I think we'll wrap it up. We've been going for an hour and 40 minutes, so people are probably getting fed up at this stage. So thank you all very much for joining us, and thanks to Aina for such a very interesting chat.
There you go. Thank you very much indeed. It'd be great to see the audience, but at least I can see you, Brendan, to your compensation.
Thank you.